It's real quick before we begin. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm Emily. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's. I just want to encourage you to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events online at powells.com. And if you don't already, please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tonight, we are so thrilled to welcome Jonathan Meiburg and Michael Azerrad. So in 1997, Jonathan received a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship to travel to remote communities around the world, a year-long journey that sparked his enduring fascination with islands, birds, and the deep history of the living world. Since then, he's written reviews, features, and interviews for print and online publications, including The Believer, The Talk House, and The Appendix, on subjects ranging from a hidden exhibit hall in the American Museum of Natural History, which I'm very curious about, to the last long-form interview with author Peter Matheson. But he's best known as the leader of the band Shearwater, whose albums and performances have often been praised by NPR, The New York Times, The Guardian, and Pitchfork. His newest book, A Most Remarkable Creature, The Hidden Life and Epic Journey of the World's Smartest Birds of Prey, is a riveting hybrid of science writing, travelogue, and biography. Joining him in conversation this evening is Michael Azerrad. Michael is the author of Our Band Could Be Your Life, Scenes from American Indie Underground, 1981 to 1991, and Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana. A former contributing editor for Rolling Stone, he's also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Billboard, the New York Times, and many other publications. So this evening's event will also include an audience Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that if you'd like to ask a question. And as well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up button. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting Jonathan and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. I'll be sharing a link to buy A Most Remarkable Creature, as well as Michael's books, in the chat a couple of times this evening. Jonathan, Michael, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be here with you.
Thanks for having us. And thank you to Powell's for hosting this event. Powell's is a great bookstore, and I'm proud to be a longtime customer. Maybe I'll just do a little intro of John here. On a personal level, John is not only a dear friend, but he's my Shazam for birds.
Yeah, Michael's been sending me pictures of birds outside his window now for the past year.
Yeah, I email them out this window right here, actually. And I email Jonathan a photo, and he gets right back to me and he identifies the bird. Now I know that I've seen a red-bellied woodpecker, a downy woodpecker, eastern kingbird, a mockingbird, a chuck-will's widow, a house finch, a scarlet tanager, which was...
I was very impressed by the scarlet tanager. That was really awesome. I was kind of jealous.
And an olive-sided flycatcher. But that's kind of a parlor game, I think, for Jonathan. His knowledge of and love of birds is very wide and deep, and he loves to share it, not just with his friends, but with, people. And that's what you get from reading A Most Remarkable Creature, which is a most remarkable book. Yeah, let's just get into it. So this book, A Most Remarkable Creature, is about the caracara bird, which has different variations that we'll get into.
Yeah, there's caracaras are they're a group of falcons, basically. There's 10 of them, 10 species of these birds, and they live entirely in South America except for one species which comes further north. Which we'll probably get to that. But they're falcons, but they're not what you think of when you think of a falcon.
Yeah, the ornithologist Joan Morrison, you quote her, she called the caracara a quote dirty bird, quote unquote, and a quote bad falcon. Someone else in the book calls them cheeky bastards.
Yep.
Why does the caracara get such a bad rap?
With affection. Yeah, even Darwin called them false eagles who ill become so high a rank.
Yeah.
And
why do they get the bad rap?
They don't act the way birds of prey are supposed to. We think of birds of prey as these sort of majestic, solitary, efficient killers, often of other birds, especially falcons. And Caracaras, partly I think because South America has never had large crows for reasons that we may get into later, but there aren't any. You can go all throughout South America. You'll never see a big black crow or a raven, anything like that. And it's as if instead um, evolutionary forces have built a crow on a falcon chassis and produced this suite of birds that live there that fulfill this role. They're scavengers, they're omnivores, they're social, they're very, very smart. And one of them in particular, which is kind of the MacGuffin of the book, is called a striated caracara. And it's the one depicted in the painting on the cover, this is actually the first image ever painted of one, at least by a European person, in 1775, when the naturalist traveling with Captain James Cook painted one down in Tierra del Fuego. But these birds live on islands off of Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America and in the Falkland Islands, which is where Darwin met them in 1833. And Michael, I showed you a picture earlier of this image of Darwin from that time. Can I pull that up?
Yeah.
I'm going to share my screen here. This is the only contemporary illustration of Darwin aboard the Beagle that we know of. It was probably painted by a man named Augustus Earle, but it's a cartoon that seems to have been kind of done just for the amusement of the people on board the ship. And you can't read these captions here very well, but it says it's the quarterdeck of a man of war on interesting scenes from an interesting voyage. And in the middle of it, here's Darwin with Captain Fitzroy next to him. And Darwin, you have to remember, at this time was 22 years old. If he walked in the room now, he just looked like a kid. And he was a rich kid, essentially, who had an assured future as a country priest, but he really loved beetles, and he was kind of interested in geology, and his family was well connected enough that he got this opportunity to accompany the captain on this trip. Now, the trip was a surveying trip. It wasn't designed for Darwin to discover anything. It was about mapping the islands and channels at the southern tip of South America, which were notoriously treacherous and convoluted. And the captain was afraid of taking this trip because the previous captain of the ship had committed suicide in this very place. And he was worried about not having anybody to talk to because the captain's kind of a lonely person by definition. And so he wanted to bring along somebody who could just be his buddy. And a couple of his friends said no. And when Darwin was suggested, he wasn't too keen on it, but Darwin went down to meet him. And then Darwin had to convince his own father that it was a good idea for him to go away for a couple of years. His father said no. Darwin wrote to his uncle, who persuaded his father that, these kinds of things. So Darwin, who wasn't all that great a student, but he was real good at riding and shooting and other sort of upper class pastimes, gets on board the Beagle. And he just decides that he's going to try to make everything he can out of this opportunity to see places that no one who's interested in the natural world like he was had really ever spent much time in, no European, I should say. And in the Falklands, which he gets to in 1833, he meets these weird birds. Now, in this cartoon, it's a funny thing. You can see all these people are carrying around all these objects, and they're bringing them to Darwin for the most part, who's collected a bunch of strange things, skulls and tusks and the little swordfish down there. And they're bringing them to him because he's going to pay them for them, including this guy who says, I don't know if you can see it, says the least I can get for these is a tot. He's holding his hat full of seashells there, meaning a tot of rum, meaning, he can get at least enough money that he can get drunk off it. And over on the other side of him, there's a guy who's got some strange creature in his hand. He says, I've killed a fine specimen of a flying monkey, shot 3 specimens of geese, and was very near being yaffled by a damned big bear. I don't know where he got the bear from, because there weren't any bears in the part of South America that they went to. But a flying monkey is a pretty funny thing. And it looks like the artist has just conjured up an imaginary creature there with clearly got whiskers and wings. But in the Falklands, he met this bird that was known by whalers and sealers as a flying monkey or a flying devil or a number of other sort of funny epithets. And these are some of the islands off Tierra del Fuego. They're very, very forbidding looking places covered in seabirds and seals and not much else. We'll come back to this South America map, but this is where the Falklands are, down here, way off the southern tip. And South America, you can see, is kind of at an angle here. It's not the way we're used to looking at it. And really rather close to Antarctica, you can see. There's the Falklands. And here's this, in the corner, you can see the Jason Islands. And this is actually where the book begins, is in this place. Steeple Jason is this island in the northwest corner of the Falklands. And here's a picture of it. And here's a striated caracara zooming in to see about these penguins. And this is the bird. And Darwin was amazed not just by their appearance, which looked to him like a mixture of a hawk and a crow, but their behavior, in that they came right up to him and just stared at him as if they had every right to be there just as much as him. And in fact, all the animals in the Falklands were kind of like this, but these went even further. They tried to take things from the crew of the Beagle. They stole hats. They stole a small cater's compass in a red Morocco leather case, which was never recovered, he said. And he couldn't figure out what these birds were exactly, why they were only in the Falklands and Tierra del Fuego and nowhere else, and why they behaved in this way. And those are sort of the major questions of the book. I'm going to stop there, Michael, and otherwise I'm going to launch into the rest of an hour-long lecture.
Right. Okay. But just back up a little. How did, I mean, you know, as I've said, you know about a lot of different birds. Why is this one? Why did this one capture your fancy enough to dedicate years of your life to writing this amazing book about?
Well, I met them completely by accident. I didn't know they were there, but the fellowship that Emily mentioned was the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship that I got when I was Darwin's age, basically. I was 21. And I pitched this project because what the Watson Fellowship does is it funds you to pursue a project that you design yourself in one or more non-US countries. And the only rules are that you have to stay out for the whole year, you can't take anybody with you, and you can't affiliate with any institution. You just have to pursue this project on your own in places you've never been to before. And mine was pitched as a study of community life at the ends of the earth. So 21-year-old me just kind of looked at a map and said, well, what are the most remote places I can think of? And this was one of them. And I had some idea that you could see penguins in the Falklands, which you can. They've got 5 different species that normally, they often nest there. But I thought that'd be interesting to see. I never thought I'd get to see live penguins in the wild in my life. And I went out to visit them on this one island and met these caracaras there. And like Darwin, I was kind of just amazed by them. They ran right up to me. One of them stole my pen. They just stared at me as if sometimes they would even they would fly above my head just a little bit so that you'd look down, you'd see this shadow growing of this big winged shadow merging with your shadow. And you look up and there'd be one of them just like hanging there with its feet dangling to just tap you on the head. And then off they would go. And it seems a little mystical, but I had the feeling at that moment that they were just choosing me for something or asking me to do something or asking me for an explanation of something. And that feeling kind of worked on me for a long time throughout that year, and then on into some graduate work on the birds and this Darwin's question about why were they there and nowhere else. And that was what eventually grew into the book. But it wasn't just their rarity or their obscurity. It was this funny behavior that really, they were charming. They charmed me and I was hooked.
Yeah, you often talk a lot about the personality of the caracara and of other birds in the book. When sometimes you'll call a stupid person will be called a bird brain. And birds are, people think of them as being driven purely by instinct, almost like automatons that are just built for flying and feeding and, reproducing. That's it. But you have found something deeper in birds, and especially in the caracara. And, why is that? Why do they have a personality?
Why are they like this?
And why are they so curious? And, curiosity killed the cat. Why didn't it kill them?
Why was it helpful for these guys? Yeah. Well, the Striatids, the ones in the Falklands and Tierra del Fuego, are especially this way, but all 10 species are like this to one degree or another. But in the Falklands, they've got a funny situation because they really have no natural predators there. And I'll share my screen again here to show you a couple more pictures. Here's one. I mentioned that there are penguins on that island, Steeple-Jason. There are also about 140,000 albatrosses, which if you imagine like a sort of seagull type bird with about an 8-foot wingspan, that's an albatross. And it's a breeding colony for them in the summer months. And the caracaras feed in part on their chicks and eggs. But in the wintertime, it looks like this. All these sort of tire-shaped structures are actually albatross nests that the albatrosses build out of mud. And here's one lonely striated caracara standing on the edge of one in the wintertime going like, when are they coming back? But the caracaras have a real problem because the seabirds can leave in the wintertime. They can drink salt water, they can feed at sea. They don't need land for anything. But the caracaras can't do any of that. They can't swim, they can't drink salt water. They have to live by their wits. And so anything that the sea casts up is a subject for immediate investigation for them. And for its food value or for anything at all. And they seem interested in things simply for the sake of their novelty, as if they just can't, the urge to investigate anything new is so overwhelming that it supersedes almost all other impulses that they have. And one reason that they're like this is because when Darwin was confounded by their sort of tameness in the Falklands, but part of the reason was that the Falklands are just about the only part of the entire quote unquote new world that Europeans actually discovered. As far as we know, no Amerindian people ever reached the Falklands or had any reason to suspect that they were there. And so the animals that were there were innocent of humans, which is really extraordinary because for many thousands of years, that hadn't been the case in most other parts of the world. So what we see in Darwin's account is a human being and this very intelligent animal encountering one another for the first time, and which most of these encounters went unrecorded, but this one didn't. And so them staring at each other is really a wonderful moment. And when you visit them now, they're still like this. The Galapagos actually are very similar for the same reason. They also, as far as we know, never had any Amerindian people visit them. And so you get the sense, it makes you realize that animals run away. You expect animals to run away from you. You expect them to flee from you. But this is not something that was intrinsic to their behavior. They had to learn to do this. They had to learn to be afraid of us. And the natural state of animals was to regard us not as enemies or but as peers.
It's funny though, because the Caracara has learned to live off some of the things that we leave behind. I mean, it's actually, sometimes it follows people rather than flees them.
Yeah, there are species in South America that are common at garbage dumps and, are good at sorting out pizza boxes and plastic bags and all kinds of human leavings, which not every bird is able to do, but they've got the kind of flexibility that seems to enable them to do it. They can learn quickly.
Yeah, you make a distinction between types of birds, the generalists and the specialists.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that distinction because it applies to people too. There are people who adjust to very different situations, and then there are other people who have very set ways of doing things, and that's the way it's done.
It's like what Isaiah Berlin said about the fox and the hedgehog. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing.
Right.
And the striated caracaras, falcon relatives that we know from the northern hemisphere, you think of like peregrine falcons and kestrels. I mean, they've learned one big thing, but really what seems to have happened was that the falcons as a group probably came up into South America from Antarctica after the Cretaceous extinctions. Because you have to remember, birds are the dinosaurs that lived. And the dinosaurs that lived probably lived in the far south of the world. So they came north into South America. They diversified throughout South America, which is still where the greatest diversity of falcons, the greatest variety of falcons is found today. There are forest falcons, which people know almost nothing about. There's one called a laughing falcon that eats snakes. And there's caracaras. But one of these birds, one group of them ended up going north and occupying the northern hemisphere. And those are the so-called true falcons that are more familiar to most people. But they're all very closely related. It's why falconers are able to breed different kinds of falcons with one another, because they've separated very recently in time compared to these other sort of more ancestral lineages. But they're not clever in the same way. So you wonder if the true falcons kind of gave up this kind of generalist, curious, what we might call intelligent mind, so that they could become these peerless hunters.
This bird also has some, not just the talent for finding human garbage, but there's a connection with people. And you mentioned this guy named Jeff Pearson.
Yes. Yeah. There's a number of captive striated caracaras, even though the number of striated caracaras in the world may not be more than the number of giant pandas. It's a rare species, but for reasons that I describe in the book that I won't get into now, that are also kind of a wild ride, a number of them ended up in England. And they're relatively common in English falconry parks, even though they're not famous. But if you go to falconry parks, are in some ways kind of an English phenomenon. I mean, we have them in the United States, but not at the density that you find them in England. These collections of birds of prey and places where people demonstrate them by having them fly to a glove or catch a bait twirled on a line or something like that. But these caracaras, falconers are just absolutely perplexed by, because they're not like other birds of prey. If you read H is for Hawk, you know about the goshawk that Helen Macdonald trained, and the process she had to go through to get it to accept her presence, called manning, which is sort of like breaking a horse. You have to really break the bird's will to get it to accept you as just a fact of its life. But this process doesn't work with caracaras. But luckily, they kind of want to be your friend. So Jeff Pearson, this is a woman named Lorraine McGill in the Falklands, who's got some friends who hang out behind her kitchen door. Jeff, pictured here with a falcon, striated caracara that he named Tina, they became close friends. And Tina, he first sort of alerted Jeff that there was something different about her by playing a game with him. He dropped his keys one day when he walked into her aviary, and she picked them up and ran to the other side of the aviary. Well, one thing that's special about caracaras is they like to run around on the ground. They actually have an extra muscle in their legs that the true falcons have lost. It makes it easy for them to walk and run. And she just picked these things up and sat there staring at him. And he thought, this is a game. She's trying to play a game with me, which is something he'd never seen from a hawk or an owl or an eagle. And from then on, every day, that was how the day began. She would pick up his keys, and then she would eventually trade them for food. And he started sort of tinkering, thinking about how could he test this bird's mind. And he devised this set of devices to test her color perception. And when he would do flying demonstrations with her, instead of having her fly to his glove, he would have her retrieve, say, a square-shaped block from a set of different shaped blocks at the audience's request, or a different colored ball, again, at the audience's request. And on video, you can actually see a performance where Tina, who's working with Jeff's assistant, Lynn, selects a couple of stuffed animals from a group of stuffed animals that Lynn throws over his shoulder. He says, go find Nemo. And she walks down, picks up Nemo, comes back and drops it in a bucket. And then he says, now go get Miss Piggy. And she goes and gets Miss Piggy and comes back and puts Miss Piggy in the bucket. And just this kind of thinking was just not something that they'd ever seen before from another bird of prey.
But it's also interesting, generally humans bond with mammals, your cat, your dog, chimpanzees, things like that. But birds are, very different from human beings. And I was just amazed reading the book at how connected human beings can be with a bird.
Yeah, I mean, evolutionarily, the last time that you and I had a common ancestor with a dog was about 100 million years ago. For a bird, it's about 300 million years ago, to a time when we were all amniotes, which are these sort of amphibian-like things that laid eggs and lived in swamps. And then when you think about, okay, but we've been on separate evolutionary trajectories for 300 million years, that means it's really 600 million years of evolutionary time that lie between the last time that we had a common ancestor with them. And yet these two species, this bird and this man, were able to be friends across that chasm of time, is just extraordinary.
Yeah, I was just wondering what is the commonality there? Can why can Jeff relate to Tina or later his other bird Evita?
Yeah, this is Evita actually right here, who's playing with her stuffed ancient relative. She birds' brains, and this has been discovered partly by more recent research. I mean, there's been a lot of research recently with crows and ravens and with parrots. Nobody is researching Caracara's brains or behavior at the moment. So it's, I mean, there are a few people who are starting, but it's in its infancy compared to work with crows or with parrots. But birds evolved something not unlike our forebrain, but they evolved it out of a different structure within their brains called a pallium. And this structure performs, it seems to perform about the same functions as our forebrain does, but they made one themselves. And it makes you feel that the qualities, the suite of qualities that we call intelligence, that there are many different avenues to get there. I mean, there's recently it's been, octopuses have been in the news a lot for their amazing cognitive capabilities, despite the fact that their brains are organized nothing like ours at all.
Well, they're from outer space, as
right.
we know.
Oh, yeah, I forgot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So the book it basically begins with you in the Falklands interacting with these striated caracaras, which are also called Johnny Rooks. But then,
yeah, it's one of those names from the whaling days.
Yep. And then, but then you move to, you're looking for the red-throated caracara, which is in a completely different part of the world. And that, I think of that as it's not heart of darkness, it's heart of lightness. It sounds like you had a lot of fun going up this river in the middle of the jungle.
That section of the book, is about my favorite part of the book.
Yeah, tell us about first, what bird you were looking for there and why, but also just the cast of characters, the gentleman that you traveled with. That's also as much fun as learning about the bird.
Well, this is the thing, and it's part of what's important about the book is that it's not just a book about birds. There are a lot of people who are very important to this book. One of them, besides Darwin, is this naturalist named William Henry Hudson, who, sorry to scroll through, there we go, there he is, who was born in Argentina and grew up knowing caracaras very well, not striated caracaras, but crested and chimango caracaras. Chimangos are these very small, crow-sized caracaras that are just ubiquitous in the place that he grew up, which is in the Pampas, the broad grassland south of Buenos Aires. And what was I saying about Hudson? Eventually he immigrated to England and he became famous for writing about English landscapes and founding the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. But it was South America that really shaped him. And he's sort of in some ways, kind of our avatar through the book. He's a character who appears again and again. But one of his most famous novels is called Green Mansions. And it's set in the tropical forests of Guyana, which are a place that he never went. But it is a place where there are some very interesting caracaras. There are tropical caracaras that are quite different from the ones in the far south. And one of them, that's a carunculated caracara, that's in the Andes. We won't talk about that one right now. But in Guyana, I thought it would be fun to go to the place that Hudson was imagining to see the caracaras that live there. And so I went there with, in the company of, now Guyana, I should explain, the Guyanas are what's called the Guyanas are three countries in South America that rarely get written about. They're between Venezuela and Brazil in the sort of the northeast corner of South America. And they have small human populations that, and the people there don't speak Spanish or Portuguese. The country of Suriname, which is sort of in the center, used to be called Dutch Guyana, and people still speak Dutch there, among other languages. French Guiana, to the east of that, is still technically part of France. They speak French, they use the euro. You can cross a remote range of mountains in Brazil and suddenly end up in the Eurozone on the only border crossing where you're likely to be eaten by a jaguar when you're entering Europe. But Guyana used to be British Guyana, and people there speak English, which was very convenient for me. And it's a remarkably open place, and it has beautiful intact primary forest in its southern part, which is the habitat that's preferred by red-throated caracaras. So I went to go find red-throated caracaras with 3 Amerindian men from this region. This is Josie George, Rambo Roberts there with a small black caiman, and Brian Duncan. And then also a Canadian scientist named Sean McCann, who had been studying red-throated caracaras, who eat almost nothing but wasps' nests and occasionally bits of fruit. They seem to be the only bird of prey that's given up running after things that fly away from them. I'll show you some red-throated caracaras in a second, but a trigger warning for arachnophobes for the next image. If you're afraid of spiders, you may not want to look at this. Oh, whoops, not that one, sorry. There we go. This is Sean McCann, and that's not costume jewelry. That's in fact the largest spider in the world, the Goliath bird eater, which he really wanted to make a close acquaintance with, so he did. If I had to include this picture because this instance is described in the book, and I just didn't think anyone would believe it if I didn't actually put in evidence. But here's a red-throated caracara. And so you can see they're just a remarkable sort of Muppety-looking bird. And they live in family groups of multiple individuals. They nest in giant bromeliads. They raise 1 chick at a time, it seems, and they just bring them, they fly around a territory that they maintain by doing these dances and screaming and calling, and they have a very complicated vocal, what seems to be a complicated vocabulary. And they have that curiosity common to all the caracaras. You really feel when they're looking at you that there's a mind ticking and thinking and wondering about what to do about you. And here is a young one on its nest, as photographed by Sean, seeing a human being for the first time. And you can see bits of wasp comb next to it. And what Sean went to go find out was whether these birds, as was legendarily alleged, secrete a natural wasp repellent. And I describe his quest to try to figure this out in the book. I won't reveal the answer right now, so you'll have to read the book to find out. But his quest involved a guitar amp and a bee suit and a crossbow and all kinds of strange contraptions to try to answer this question. But one thing that he did find was when you look at this picture, you can see there's a millipede in the bottom of the nest. This millipede is dead and is one of several that the adults kept bringing to the nest. But the chick, they would hold them up to the chick, but the chick didn't eat them. They would just drop them. They would bite their heads to kill them and drop them in the nest. And Sean suspects that they may in fact be using these millipedes as a form of pest control, because millipedes have lived for more than 400 million years. It seems because they taste really bad. They have these wonderful things called repugnatory glands that ooze this sort of noxious, horrible smelling stuff, as you know if you've ever handled one. And they're just, you don't really want to eat that. But it may have repellent properties. And some monkeys, and in fact lemurs in Madagascar even, will anoint themselves with millipedes. They'll sort of chew on them and rub them all over themselves, and sometimes kind of get high off of that. So Sean thinks that the caracara is also maybe using these things as a type of chemical technology.
I really love that section of the book. I think partly because it's about the journey as much as it is about the bird, but it's also about the people you're traveling with. And was it Josie, Rambo, and Brian are all, they're locals, and they fill you in on lore and local legends, especially legends that have to do with the bird that you're studying. And they even have a nickname for that bird.
Bush anti-man. Which is an amazing nickname for a bird, because anti-man throughout the Caribbean is this sort of it's a slur for a gay man, and it's like, why on earth would you call this bird this? And as far as I can tell, it probably has to do with the fact that because they're so observant and make a great big ruckus if they see anything they think is amiss, that if you're hunting in the forest, and one of these things sees you, it'll call in its friends, and they scream and cry, and your chance of sneaking up on anything are pretty much ruined. So I think it was partly a term of annoyance, but maybe not entirely. There's that was very mysterious to me. I still don't quite understand why that name for these birds.
Although there is this kind of thread of this bird being somewhat of a pariah or something, like outlier or outcast, or some there's a thread in this book where, like I say, it gets called a cheeky bastard and a bad falcon and all these things. And then there are people like you and William Henry Hudson who redeem the bird.
Yeah, Hudson said that he was talking about those little chimango caracaras that were common on the farm. He said a bird so cosmopolitan in its habits would have a whole volume to itself in England, but being only a poor foreigner, it has had no more than a few unfriendly paragraphs bestowed upon it. Because they sort of violate this sense of what a bird of prey ought to be, I think that's kind of scared some scientists away from thinking about them. They're confusing. They're not the right combination of things. They're not as noble as they ought to be. They're not as severe as they ought to be. But also, people generally aren't that fond of animals that are like us and understand us, like rats. You know, all the animals that do really well around human beings, or pigeons for that matter, which understand us very well. How many times have you heard the term "rats with wings" for pigeons in New York? And the caracaras, it's kind of in Argentina. There's a saying, "No gastes pólvora en chimango," which means don't waste your ammunition on a chimango. It's like it's worthless.
And I mean, yeah. I saw in your Twitter profile, you call yourself a writer, musician, and caracara publicist.
That's right. I'm on a mission to reclaim these, or not reclaim them, but to rehabilitate the image of these birds.
Good, because they seem incredibly cool.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you don't have to spend any time with them to have this feeling. This isn't like an acquired taste, I don't think, where he's like, I got to spend a lot of time getting into this. No, from the moment that you meet them, if you can meet them, I promise you will be smitten.
We're getting towards the end here, but so are there larger truths to be gleaned from learning about this bird? Do we take inspiration from them, for instance, for being able to, as you put it, survive upheaval? What do we take away from this book besides learning a lot of fascinating stuff about a really intriguing bird, and also a ton of fascinating things about evolution and plate tectonics and all kinds of
why
really
the world
interesting
is the
things.
way it is. Like the one of the major facts of the book is that South America and North America are very, very different, which puzzled Darwin completely because he didn't know that we're talking about not just geologically, but the flora and fauna of the two continents is so different. And Darwin said it's impossible to contemplate the changed state of the American continent, by which he meant South America, without the greatest astonishment. And I also quote a Jesuit naturalist from the 16th century, Bernabe Cobo, who was just driven into absolute fits by trying to understand why the animals that he saw in Mexico were not present in Peru, and vice versa, because for him this was a theological problem. All the animals in the world had issued from Noah's Ark after the flood, and he didn't understand why they would stop in these certain places, and how animals that were nowhere near the Middle East didn't occur anywhere else. And eventually he decided that by a miracle of the angels had all, having brought all the animals of the world to Noah, that they had then arrived and put them all back where they were. But you can see him really wrestling with this in his writing. And South America, it was home to this wild variety of all these different animals that were completely isolated, like Australia is, by ocean until about 3 to 5 million years ago, when the Isthmus of Panama finally connected North and South America. But the continents had spent more than 100 million years apart at that point. So even today, like in North America, and animals and plants and insects started to travel between them across this land bridge. And even today, like there are 3 animals in North America that come from South America. Possums, armadillos, and porcupines. Far more animals from the north went south and have thrived there. And in fact, a lot of the native mammals of South America went extinct, either during that time or then when people came into the continent about 15,000 years ago. Things like giant ground sloths and glyptodonts, which were like huge armored lawnmowers, and terror birds, and marsupial saber-toothed animals, all these strange things that went extinct in South America. But there are also survivors. And the caracaras are among them. When you go to the high Andes, you can see mountain caracaras in places where the only other footprints you see are of guanacos, which are the ancestors of llamas, and pumas, and foxes, and humans, all of which arrived from North America, except for the caracaras.
What I was kind of getting at was, going back to that idea of the generalist and the specialist, we live in, as the proverbial interesting times. Things
Yes.
are changing very quickly, and we have to adapt, and we have to become more like the caracara, more of a generalist than a specialist, because the old set in our ways approach, is just continuously is proven to be inadequate. And so, I found some inspiration in the caracara.
There's towards the end of the book, I talk about captive caracaras in England that have gotten loose, of which there are a number. And one of them most recently was a bird at the London Zoo named Louis, who got out and spent 2 weeks on the lam in North London. According to one news article, quote, ripping into a whole cooked chicken and walking down Kilburn High Street. And when they recaptured him, they examined him and said he seemed none the worse for wear. He had done fine hanging around in North London, despite the fact that this is a bird that had had no experience of this whatsoever before in its life. It just took it as it found it. And this willingness, just as you say, Michael, to learn, to change their way of being in the world, is, I think, what's allowed them to survive for this long.
And I think that's that's a great takeaway, and perhaps a great point to take it to the audience questions.
Let me stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah. Anonymous attendee asks, are they communal hunters like Harris hawks?
Oh, that's a good question. Not in this. Harris hawks are these really interesting hawks that live in the desert Southwest and Sonoran Desert in Mexico, who hunt in groups for things like jackrabbits. Like a couple of them will chase a jackrabbit into a bush while there's another one waiting to catch it, that kind of thing. Striated caracaras certainly will do this in the Falklands when they're pursuing penguins. One of them will distract a penguin while another one grabs the egg off of its nest, that kind of thing. And mountain caracaras have been seen. Oh my God, Sean McCann is here. Sean McCann is the man with the spider on his face. And I have to tell you, actually, he's just back from French Guyana. He did get to go down and hang out with the red-throated caracara some more, which you'll realize if you read the book is a happy ending for Sean, because he wasn't sure if that would get to happen. I won't say why, but wow. The red throats, they do cooperate in attacking these wasp nests, and but the secret of I'm going to keep the secret of why they're able to do this for the book.
I was also really struck by how they hang out and are preened or groomed, or whatever the word is, by it was a certain species of vulture, I can't remember, but they, you would think that these birds would be in competition and be at each other's throats, but no, they hang out and clean each other. Yeah,
there's a let's see if I can find. Yeah, there we go. There's a black vulture preening a crested caracara in South Texas. These are sort of like with ravens. We talked a little bit about in England there's a falconry park where they keep a raven and a striated caracara in adjacent enclosures, and looking at them you almost feel like you're looking at the same bird, or the two attempts to build the same animal on a different design. And black vultures are very social, are very, very clever, highly intelligent birds, and they seem to get along really well with the caracaras. They eat the same foods, they like eating dead stuff, and they seem to be fine with being friends with one another.
Deborah Baker asks, the caracara's behavior reminds me of that of the Kia from New Zealand. Yes. I think I've read that falcons are more closely related to parrots than they are to hawks. does this go any way towards explaining Caracara outlier behavior?
I
Also,
think
maybe their
so.
evolution into that corvid role.
Yeah, I think you just put your finger right on it, Deborah. The falcons and parrots, and this is I talk about this in a whole section of the book, are more closely related to each other than falcons are to hawks or eagles or other birds of prey. And even though the true falcons that are more familiar to us are more sort of single-minded and hawk-like, the caracaras may give us some better sense of what ancestral falcons were like. And kias are their nearest relative. They're the oldest, or nearly the oldest, diverging lineage of parrots. Now, kias are parrots that live in New Zealand and live in snowy mountains and are famous especially for dismantling cars and carrying away hikers' boots and things like this, and also eating meat, which parrots ancestrally did and will readily in captivity. We think of parrots as these vegetarians, but the evidence suggests that probably ancestrally they were more raptorial, and the parrot falcon ancestor may have lived in Antarctica back before the Cretaceous extinctions.
Racine Barton asks, are caracaras migratory other than crested? And that gets into a whole angle of the book about, well, why are the striated caracaras only in the Falklands? And why are some other caracaras winding up in places like New York State and Montana? And what does it mean?
Well, the crested caracaras, like this is one here, and this one's actually in South Texas. The crested caracaras, there's two species, they look almost identical. And this northern crested caracaras seem to be moving north within the United States now. As Michael just said, they've turned up in New York State for the first time a few years ago. They've turned up in Canada. Let's see here. Oops. Well, there's a picture that I thought I had of one, but it's maybe may have gone missing. Oh, here it is. This bird, I'll come back. All these pictures are in the book, by the way, so if you don't get a good long look at them, you have to get the book and then you can look at them as long as you like.
Especially that one with the spider.
The spider, yeah, especially the spider. Come here. Well, I don't know why that one's not showing up, but but you can see it here. This bird is in Skykomish, Washington. It's about 30 miles east of Seattle. It's a wild bird. It just turned up there. And but you asked about why the other caracaras aren't migratory, or are they migratory? We don't really know about some of the species. Their seasonal movements haven't really been studied in particular, but there aren't these long distance migrations like you associate with peregrine falcons, for instance, whose name means traveler. And the striatids are really stuck where they are. It explains sort of how they ended up in this position in the book. But they're just surrounded by water. If you look at the range of ravens, it's the entire northern hemisphere just about, where most of the land on Earth is. If from Tierra del Fuego you set off on a ship and sailed due east or due west, the next land you would come to would be Tierra del Fuego. It's just all water down there. So they're really hemmed in. And it's going to be very difficult for them to get out of this position. Because if you go south, there's Antarctica. You go too far east and there's just the Atlantic Ocean. You go too far west and it's the Pacific. It's just not hospitable.
But why are some of these birds traveling so far up north?
We don't know. My guess is that they may be in part following black vultures, which are definitely moving north. I think they've occupied the Hudson Valley within the last 10 years. They used to be uncommon. Now they breed there frequently. And my theory is that there's a new predator that's emerged in North America that rivals all the Pleistocene monsters that we think of, the saber-toothed cats and the dire wolves and all this kind of thing. And it's called cars. Every year, I was looking at this one statistic that in 2014, I think, the number of deer killed on highways in North America, in the United States, sorry, North America includes Mexico, but in Canada, but the number of deer killed on highways in the United States was equal to the number of wildebeest in the Serengeti. And that's just deer. You're not talking about cats and dogs and coyotes and foxes and skunks and raccoons and just all this carnage that's generated by cars every single night. And if you're a scavenging bird, this is a buffet of Pleistocene proportions, and it's laid out along these entirely predictable routes, with these little strips of open country, you know, that just every day you know where these things are going to be. And I think that the caracaras may be following their old scavenging friends back into North America, or at least the crested caracaras, because they used to be here during the Pleistocene. They're in the La Brea tar pits. They're in fossil deposits in Arkansas. They were here. But they're still the northernmost of the caracaras. The caracaras, for the most part, have remained in the South. And the thing is, to get out of South America, you've got to do something extraordinary. You've got to make it through the tropical forest and through this tiny little bottleneck of the isthmus. So it's really quite a hard place to escape. And they seem to have mostly just been fine staying where they are.
You know, actually, I wanted to squeeze in a kind of a personal question. There's, you know, it's been said that all biography is autobiography. And you describe William Henry Hudson as combining a naturalist's eye with a literary mind. Yeah. That sounds like my friend Jonathan. He loves science and art. And that sounds like my friend Jonathan too. And all those things fit you and this book. And I was curious about how much you relate to Hudson professionally, maybe not personally.
Well, and why Hudson would have sort of had a soft spot for caracaras too. You know, this bird that lived by its wits. And I mean, he had to completely invent himself when he came to England. No, he was poor. Nobody knew him. He spent decades in obscurity trying to write. I guess, and it makes me wonder, you know, when I first met these birds, you know, there's a joke about scientists resembling their study species. Like you or the thing calls to you because it reminds you of yourself. I don't know if that's what happened with me exactly, but there is, I mean, obviously I sort of admire this generalist approach. I opted not to pursue an academic career because I wanted to tour in bands. But my interest in these birds never left me. And Hudson would never describe himself as a scientist. He called himself a writer and field naturalist. And he was kind of shunned by ornithologists in his day, or snubbed by them. But at the same time, he had an appreciation for not just birds, but entire landscapes full of life, but of animals' minds. They said all that is in our minds is also in theirs. He was far ahead of his time in his thinking about animal consciousness and what we might call a sort of ecological perspective that was unusual thinking at the time.
It's Jessica Happany, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asked, what are their family units like, and do they have a social hierarchy?
That's a very good question. Some species of caracara form, as adults, form monogamous pairs, but often as young birds, they kind of hang around together in these age class kind of foraging groups. The striated caracaras are especially amazing in this way. They're these large groups of young birds that just sort of hang around looking for whatever they can find and seeing what everybody else is eating. And, you know, they're very quick to take advantage of each other's successes. And the same with the chimangos. Now, those red-throated caracaras, this is one of the most fascinating questions about them, because their family groups seem to be composed of multiple adults, multiple males, multiple females. There may be a sort of a dominant female in the group who's actually laying the eggs, but it's a very open question about what's actually going on there. And in the mountain caracaras that have been seen working to turn over rocks in the high desert by working together to lift these things with 1 foot each, you know, 3 birds with each with 1 foot on this rock and lifting it over to uncover like a lizard or something underneath. That group that was seen was 2 adults and a younger bird, but you sometimes see groups of 3 or 4 adult individuals hanging out together and even displaying together, doing these territorial calls. Which makes you think that their family units may be a little more plastic than what we're used to associating with many birds. But it's certainly, though, with birds in general, every mating system you can imagine is practiced by birds. There are birds that are almost strictly monogamous. There are birds where everybody mates with everybody. It just varies by species and by, you know, the landscape.
I was really interested in that scene where you describe, I think it's three caracaras overturning a rock to get to a little skink lizard.
Mhm.
And, that's basically using tools, or it's problem solving. And it's cooperation amongst, birds of prey, which is not something, I don't know a whole lot about birds, but I didn't think that birds of prey would cooperate. But thirdly, skinks, as I believe, are a pretty small bird. So
But it's a lizard.
I mean a lizard.
Yeah.
And I would think that only one of those caracaras could have eaten that skink, or did they all share it?
I think in that case, if I'm remembering this right, there were two birds. There was one that served as sort of like a watcher, and then one was, quote, responsible for prey capture. And then in one case, that bird picked up the item, whatever it was. It could have also been like one of those little Andean rodents called tuco-tucos, and gave it to the other bird to eat.
That strikes me as very unusual. Cooperating just to feed, three different birds cooperating just so one could get the food.
Hudson talked about a crested caracara giving a frog to another crested caracara, and he said it was not a very magnificent present, but it nonetheless suggests that the species has some commendable qualities not otherwise seen in raptorial species or something like that.
See, there he is, William Henry Hudson, redeeming the caracara once again. It's not the bad falcon. It's not the cheeky bastard. It has a heart.
No, they're really good at what they do, and they're very charming. And I'm really hoping that they're only one facet of the just absolutely vast amount of things that we don't know about the world. Even big flashy things like birds of prey. I figured that scientists knew everything about animals. I was astonished to learn in those past 25 years since I met these guys that actually there's a very tiny number of scientists out there studying animals in the wild. That makes nobody any money, so nobody ever wants to fund this kind of research. And there's a great deal not known about the living world at almost every scale. I mean, forget about birds, if you want to talk about invertebrates, I mean, if you could find a new bird, discover a quote unquote new bird, you'd have a paper in Nature. If you find a new marine worm, you couldn't get anybody to publish that paper, despite the fact that they're just as important.
But so worms aren't cute.
I beg to differ. They can be very cute, and they're abundant too. They're not rare, but there's just so much more to learn about the world, and not all knowledge is contained in the internet. Not everything known is written. Not everything written is known. And that sense, that sort of reverence for all that remains to be learned about the world we live in is really more than anything what I'd like people to take away from the book.
It just kind of ties into a question from Julie Thompson, who asks,
"Oh, hey, Julie.
What do you still wonder about caracaras?"
Gosh, everything. I feel like I've learned so little about them. I mean, if you're asking about specific questions, I would love to know more about what's keeping striated caracaras, for instance, in the Falklands from reoccupying islands from which they've been chased away by people, or what might help facilitate them to do that. The red-throated caracaras that Sean was studying, like I was talking about their family structure and how they manage that, and what their caloric requirements are, how they manage to get that out of their diet, whether or not they're actually using those millipedes as a pesticide or not. Any one of these species, if you just sat and took a hard look at it, you would find out something amazing. And that's not just true about caracaras. That's true with all kinds of living things. It's in the world we live in is one where we're not really encouraged to just sit and focus on an animal in this way.
We are now at the end of our time, but I'll ask the traditional last question that authors get asked, which is, have you got an idea for a next book?
Oh God! This project from its inception to now is, like I mentioned, is almost 25 years. At that rate, I guess I got one more, because I'm going to keel over before I finish the third one. But I do have a few ideas. There's a screenplay I really want to write about some German geologists who tried to wait out World War II in the Namib Desert in Africa. There's also I think sort of dovetailing under this book, I hinted it in the book, but the role that Antarctica has played in the past and may play in the future of our planet and of human, and of human politics, I think is the past and future of Antarctica would be a really fascinating book. But I'd like to take just a little bit before I dive back into that horrible morass of guilt and self-flagellation and terror that Michael, you know very well.
I was so struck by the way, by that section about Antarctica, where you talk about it was once, a verdant forest, and then this Cretaceous, event happens, and it becomes this frozen ice cap. And there's
but not because of that. Because there's then 30 million years go by, and it's still forested. Yeah. And it's not until that last little connection between South America and Antarctica is severed, and about 30 million years ago, that Antarctica starts to freeze. And there were forests there as recently as 3 million years ago.
Recently.
It was very, very different.
Yeah.
It was not always this icebound place.
Yes. And that is another, well, there's two things that you brought up that I really would love to highlight. One is just the idea that 3 million years is not that much time. And in the book, you talk a lot about very long periods of time and how, 1,000 years is an eye blink. And that is it's so important, I think, for human beings to understand that we are just this tiny little eye blink on this very, very long, several football fields long timeline. And
David Brower from Friends of the Earth used to say that if you compress the entire world's history into a week, and the Earth sort of cools at midnight on Sunday, dinosaurs don't appear until 4 p.m. on the following Saturday. And the Industrial Revolution is a half a second before midnight. So we're part of a much, much, much bigger story, even though we think we're the story.
And that's one of the great things about this book, is that you set the story of this bird against this gigantic, almost incomprehensible, gigantically long timeline. It's totally fascinating.
Well, they showed it to me. They enabled me to see it and feel it in the way that, that kind of seeing the world in a grain of sand, the way where sometimes it's such a big picture that you just can't take it in unless you're looking through a tiny, tiny little keyhole. And that's what the caracaras really became for me, as I, in their charming way, as I get to explore their lives.
And, and that's why one reason why it's a most remarkable bird. And that's why it's a most remarkable book too. And so maybe we'll close it out there.
Michael, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'll hand it off to Emily at Powell's.
I just want to thank you both so much for coming. It was such a wonderful presentation. I love all of your pictures, except for the spider.
Yeah, sorry, still.
And I just want to thank everyone out there for joining us. Please do consider purchasing a copy of Jonathan's book. My apologies. That's my dog wanting to say goodnight as well. This was recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel later this week if you'd like to watch it again or share it. Until then, I just hope you all have a wonderful evening. Get us out of here.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thank you, Michael.
Take care.
Good night, everybody.